Hey guys, tonight we drift into Calabria's deep south, into the port town of Gioia, Tauro, where shadows gather in the alleys and whispers travel faster than the evening breeze. You can almost smell the salt of the Tyrrhenian Sea mixing with the diesel of fishing boats, while just behind that calm facade sits a darker truth. This land is not just olives and vineyards, not just the rolling hills kissed by the Mediterranean sun. It is also the birthplace of one of Italy's most enduring mafia dynasties, the Piromalli clan. And at the heart of it all, in the turbulent 1990s, stood Giuseppe Piromalli, the man locals would call the Patriarch of Gioia, Tauro. You probably won't survive 5 minutes here without bowing to the invisible rules he laid down. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always fascinated by the spread of our little late-night family. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of Giuseppe Piromalli cannot be told without first understanding the land itself. Calabria in the mid-20th century was stubbornly poor, a stubborn heel of Italy, where villages perched on hillsides, and survival was often a matter of hard soil and harder luck. Generations of emigration drained its youth to the industrial north, leaving behind communities that clung to tradition, but also to unspoken networks of power. In this vacuum, the 'Ndrangheta thrived. Unlike the flashier Sicilian Cosa Nostra, the Calabrian clans rooted themselves deeply in family ties and unbreakable silence. Their strength lay in blood, marriage, and geography. Giuseppe was born into this environment, a boy who saw how disputes were settled not by judges but by elders, how loyalty outweighed law, and how every feast or funeral carried undertones of hierarchy. His early life is traced less by official record and more by community memory. An intelligent child, watchful, rarely wasting words. There is a story that he once asked his father why a man never returned to the market after an argument with the clan's elder. The father simply told him, "Some things are better left unquestioned." It was an early lesson in omertà, the code of silence that would shape his entire existence. By the 1950s, the Piromalli family name already carried a certain weight in Gioia Tauro. They weren't yet the undisputed rulers of the area, but they were climbing. Smuggling small goods, cattle, and cigarettes across Calabria's rugged terrain gave them a steady income. The Mediterranean coastline offered endless opportunities. Boats landing under moonlight, cargo disappearing without customs ever knowing. Young Giuseppe learned early that the sea could carry more than fish. Mainstream history marks Gioia Tauro as a relatively unremarkable town until the Italian state announced plans for a massive industrial port. The project was conceived in the 1960s, but only gained real momentum decades later. It promised jobs, wealth, and international significance for a sleepy corner of Calabria. But it also promised something else, a playground for organized crime. The Piromalli clan, led into maturity by Giuseppe, realized faster than politicians that control of the port meant control of the future. As he rose, Giuseppe didn't display the flamboyance of certain mafia bosses you might imagine from cinema. No flashy suits, no shouting threats in public squares. His power was quieter, carried in a calm tone, in the way others lowered their gaze when he entered. He preferred to sit at the edge of a table, listen more than speak, and decide only when silence had revealed everyone else's thoughts. this restraint gave him a strange kind of charisma. Even those who despised him admitted he commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. Calabria of the 1970s and 80s was boiling with kidnappings, extortion, and rivalries. The Piromallis found their niche not just in violence, but in strategy. While other clans fought openly and drew headlines, Giuseppe understood that survival meant embedding the family into legitimate structures: construction, shipping, unions, and eventually the Port Authority itself. By the 1990s, he had woven an invisible net that spanned from local councils to international trade routes. There's a curious debate among historians. Was the mafia inevitable in Gioia Tauro, given the poverty and state neglect? Or did clans like the Piromallis actively sabotage progress to ensure dependence? Many people still think that without the Piromalli grip, the port could have become a true economic engine for Calabria rather than a symbol of corruption. So what do you think? Was it destiny, or was it deliberate manipulation? But for Giuseppe, these were not abstract questions. For him, it was about control, survival, and legacy. Every handshake, every whispered deal in a dim cafe, every contract awarded to a cousin's company built the foundation of his patriarchal rule. He had seen enough bloodshed to know that bullets win battles, but strategy wins decades. And Giuseppe Piromalli was a man planning not for days, but for generations. The sun sets over Gioia Tauro, orange light glinting off the unfinished cranes of a port that promises the world. Somewhere in town, an old man finishes his espresso, sets the cup down, and rises. Conversations hush for just a second as he passes. The Patriarch is in no rush. His rule is patient, built like Calabria's ancient stone, slow, heavy, and meant to last. The whispers of Giuseppe Piromalli's childhood form the beginning of a long shadow cast across Gioia Tauro. Born into a family that had already cultivated respect, fear, and silence, his early days were not marked by luxury, but by a constant awareness that rules existed beyond the law. In the dusty streets of Calabria, boys learned quickly who could be questioned and who could not. Giuseppe was no exception. He absorbed his surroundings with a quiet sharpness, keeping to himself, studying faces more than words, and letting silence teach him what books could not. Family stories say he had a serious demeanor even as a child, the kind who did not laugh easily at jokes other boys told while herding goats or playing in the orchards. He seemed older than his years, a child who grasped quickly that respect was not won by loudness, but by restraint. In gatherings, while cousins chattered, he lingered near the elders, listening to their lowered tones about debts, disputes, and alliances. He learned early that real lessons were never spoken at full volume. Calabria in those days was still reeling from poverty and emigration. Families scraped together what they could, many sending sons north to factories in Turin or Milan. Giuseppe stayed. His destiny was not in the factories, but in the networks of obligation and fear that defined his hometown. The 'Ndrangheta, with its intricate web of family bonds, had no interest in outsiders, and Giuseppe fit perfectly into that mold. He was already marked as one who would carry the family forward, not just survive it. A defining memory often recounted by locals, whether truth or legend, is of a young Giuseppe watching a market dispute unfold. A vendor accused another of undercutting his prices, and tensions flared. Voices rose until one of the Piromalli men stepped in. The scene ended not with fists, but with a simple, quiet statement that silenced the argument entirely. To outsiders, it seemed like nothing more than a calm word. To Giuseppe, it was revelation. True power did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Schooling for Giuseppe was brief. He was literate, of course, but his real education came from walking alongside older family members as they managed smuggling ventures. Cigarette contraband was one of the earliest trades. Small boats arriving under cover of night unloaded cartons into waiting trucks, and the goods traveled inland. Giuseppe watched, not interfering, just absorbing every gesture, every nod of approval, every frown that meant someone had erred. He was a boy learning through osmosis that crime, when organized, was simply another form of business. By the late 1950s, Gioia, Tauro was beginning to hear rumors of change. The Italian state floated plans for an industrial hub on Calabria's neglected coast. This talk stirred dreams of jobs and prosperity in households where hunger was routine. Giuseppe, though still young, listened with interest. He understood, perhaps before others did, that a project of that scale would draw more than workers. It would draw contracts, politicians, and, inevitably, the mafia. Meanwhile, the clan nurtured him with quiet expectations. He was taught discretion above all else. Elders repeated the maxim of omertà until it became a reflex. One does not see, one does not hear, one does not speak. Giuseppe embraced this ethos fully. He grew into adolescence not as a reckless youth, but as a calculating presence, someone who weighed every word before speaking. Even his contemporaries noted that he rarely wasted energy on outbursts. He was disciplined, deliberate, and already feared for his calmness. One historical fact worth noting here. During the 1950s and 1960s, Calabria was one of Italy's poorest regions, and the Italian government was pouring funds into the south through what was called the Cassa per il Mezzogiorno. Billions were allocated for roads, industries, and ports. Yet much of that money was siphoned by corrupt politicians and, eventually, by organized crime. Giuseppe's upbringing coincided with this flood of opportunities disguised as aid. He grew up knowing that state money, like smuggled cigarettes, could be intercepted and redirected with enough influence. There are debates among scholars about how early Giuseppe himself entered the inner circle of decision-making. Some claim he was leading operations by his late teens, while others argue he remained in the background, quietly sharpening his skills until his 30s. What is clear, however, is that by the 1970s, he had assumed a central role in shaping the Piromalli clan's direction. He was not content to merely inherit a name. He intended to redefine it. Think of Calabria in those years. Narrow cobblestone alleys, families gathering under olive trees, priests delivering sermons about sin and salvation, while everyone in the pews knew that disputes were handled not by God, but by the clan. Giuseppe grew into manhood with that duality ingrained, religion on one hand, ruthless pragmatism on the other. He was a man who could bow respectfully at Mass, and hours later, decide who would receive a contract and who would face ruin. By the time he reached adulthood, people no longer saw him as just Giuseppe. He was Piromalli, an identity that carried its own gravitational pull. His name opened doors and closed mouths. He didn't need to announce himself. The surname did that for him. And in a region where survival often hinged on whose name you invoked, his presence alone was enough to mark him as destined for leadership. A light-hearted joke slipped into local lore says that Giuseppe once told a childhood friend, "If you want to succeed here, you need 3 things: patience, silence, and a very good tailor." Whether or not he truly said it, the humor captures something essential about him. his ability to cloak ambition beneath calmness, to disarm with a rare smile while never letting go of control. The boy who had once watched disputes at the market now stood ready to become the man who would settle them. Calabria had shaped him, and in return, he was preparing to shape Calabria. Gioia Tauro, in the mid-20th century, was a modest town, its name barely known outside Calabria. It was a place of fishermen, farmers, and families who clung to traditions passed down like heirlooms. Yet beneath this quiet surface, change was brewing. By the 1960s and into the 1970s, Italian planners had chosen Gioia Tauro for something unprecedented, a massive deep-water port that could rival any in the Mediterranean. To the state, it was an ambitious gamble to modernize the South. To Giuseppe Piromalli, it was a glimpse of the future, a future his clan would not allow to slip from their grasp. The idea of transforming Gioia Tauro into a shipping hub was tied to Italy's larger industrial projects. Billions from the Cassa per il Mezzogiorno were to fund factories, infrastructure, and especially the construction of the port. To most Calabrians, this announcement carried the promise of jobs, stability, and perhaps an escape from poverty that had plagued the region for generations. But for organized crime, and particularly for the Piromalli family, it meant contracts, influence, and long-term control. Giuseppe's sharp mind recognized the importance of timing. As a young man, he had watched his elders dominate contraband, cigarettes, livestock, and small smuggling ventures, but he knew those trades had limits. A port, however, was limitless. Containers could carry anything: legal goods, illegal goods, and wealth funneled through layers of bureaucracy. Whoever controlled the port would control Calabria's economic heartbeat. Mainstream history confirms this anticipation. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Gioia Tauro was projected to become one of Europe's largest container ports. The cranes, yards, and shipping lanes under development promised to redirect trade routes and open southern Italy to global commerce. And in the middle of those blueprints, unseen but inevitable, stood the Piromalli clan. Giuseppe understood that brute force alone would not secure such a treasure. He needed subtlety. So while other clans waged bloody feuds in Calabria's hills, the Piromallis embedded themselves into the very machinery of the port project. Construction companies suddenly found themselves advised on whom to hire. Local unions learned that strikes could be encouraged or ended with a single nod. Politicians discovered that campaign funds arrived more quickly when they remembered to include certain cousins in their procurement committees. The plan was not rushed. Giuseppe insisted on patience. He often said to his nephews, "Concrete sets slowly, but once hardened, it holds forever." This became a metaphor for the clan's method: embed gradually, avoid attention, and build a foundation so deep it could not be removed. Meanwhile, the community around Gioia Tauro was caught in a strange paradox. Families dreamed of prosperity from the port's construction, yet they also knew in their bones that the mafia's shadow followed every promise. Conversations in cafes turned cautious. A worker hired for the project might celebrate his new job, only to learn that his wage depended not on his labor, but on his loyalty. People wanted change, but change in Calabria often came with strings pulled by invisible hands. One story, often repeated, involves a local contractor who tried to resist paying protection fees during the early stages of construction. His machinery mysteriously broke down, his workers began quitting, and soon he discovered that his bids for new contracts were rejected without explanation. Days later, he received a visit from a polite man in a pressed jacket, who simply told him, The Patriarch asks for harmony. The contractor paid, and harmony indeed was restored. It was a textbook example of Giuseppe's style, firm, quiet, and devastatingly effective. Scholars debate whether the Italian state truly underestimated the mafia's infiltration of Gioia Tauro, or whether officials simply looked the other way. Many people still think that the government knew full well the Piromallis were tightening their grip, but chose to ignore it because the port had to be built at any cost. So what do you think? Was it naive blindness or a deliberate pact with shadows? Giuseppe's influence grew not just through fear, but through the aura of inevitability. He didn't present himself as an outlaw, but as a mediator of progress. If you wanted contracts, he would ensure you received them. If you respected the unspoken rules, if you needed workers, he could provide them, loyal, efficient, and ready. Even local priests admitted quietly that when disputes arose among parishioners, it was often the Patriarch, not the courts, who settled them. By the 1990s, when the port finally began to resemble the colossal hub envisioned decades earlier, Giuseppe's vision had come true. The Piromalli clan was no longer just another Calabrian family in the 'Ndrangheta. They were the architects of Gioia Tauro's destiny, and as containers began to roll across docks under the Mediterranean sun, whispers confirmed what everyone already knew. The Patriarch's hand was on every crane, every shipment, every paycheck. And so, the port was not just concrete and steel. It was a monument to the patience and precision of Giuseppe Piromalli, a symbol of how one man could see opportunity in the state's grandest projects and quietly bend them into the service of his family's legacy. The first true lessons Giuseppe Piromalli received in the ways of his family came not from books or classrooms, but from whispered conversations and the steady presence of older men who knew the rules of survival. Calabria was a land where tradition was not just inherited, it was enforced. And in Gioia Tauro, the Piromalli clan stood as both guardians and enforcers of those traditions. Giuseppe, still young, was shaped by the iron expectation of loyalty and silence, and those lessons were often taught, not in words, but in demonstrations. He saw how disputes within the family were handled behind closed doors. Two cousins arguing over money did not scream in the streets or run to the courts. Instead, they were summoned to a dimly lit room where elders listened. Decisions were made, debts calculated, and forgiveness enforced. Giuseppe learned that authority was not about loud displays of anger, but about the calm assertion of order. If someone resisted, there were consequences, subtle at first, and harsher if necessary. These early experiences taught him that discipline was as much about restraint as it was about power. The older men of the Piromalli clan valued his quiet demeanor. Unlike hot-headed peers eager to prove themselves with violence, Giuseppe preferred to wait, to observe, to act only when absolutely necessary. His patience earned respect. One uncle is said to have told him, "Anyone can fire a gun, but only a man who waits knows when not to." It was a principle Giuseppe carried into adulthood, turning restraint into a weapon more potent than bullets. During the 1960s, Calabria was in flux. The region remained poor, but smuggling routes were expanding. Cigarette contraband from the Balkans, livestock moved across the hills, and black market fuel kept cars running in towns that saw little legitimate commerce. The Piromalli family was deeply involved in these operations, and Giuseppe was introduced to them gradually. At first, he was given small responsibilities, delivering messages, keeping watch, learning who to trust. Each task was a test, and each time he passed, his responsibilities grew. One historical fact is particularly telling. During these years, kidnappings became a major source of income for Calabrian clans. Wealthy industrialists, or their children, were snatched from northern Italy and hidden in Calabria's rugged mountains. Families paid ransoms, often enormous, which funded the growth of the 'Ndrangheta. Giuseppe, though not directly tied to every kidnapping, observed how these operations worked. The kidnappings were not just about money. They were about demonstrating the power of Calabrian clans to dictate terms to the rest of Italy. In the Piromalli household, these lessons were reinforced at every gathering. Weddings were not merely celebrations, but demonstrations of alliances. Baptisms were stages where godparents were carefully chosen for strategic ties. Funerals were reminders of loyalty and the price of betrayal. Giuseppe grew into a man who understood that every ritual, every handshake, carried meaning. To outsiders, these events might have seemed like ordinary family occasions. To Giuseppe, they were chess moves in a lifelong game. One story from his youth, often retold in Gioia, Tauro, describes a night when Giuseppe was invited to sit with the men after dinner. He was still in his teens, but he listened as they debated whether to retaliate against a rival family. Tensions were high, voices low but sharp. When asked his opinion, Giuseppe simply said, "If we strike now, we will gain an enemy forever. If we wait, he will need us first." The room fell silent. The boy's words carried a wisdom that even seasoned men acknowledged. Whether the story is embellished or not, it captures the essence of his character: patient, calculating, and unwilling to waste energy on fights that could be avoided or turned into leverage. There is debate among scholars whether Giuseppe's rise was inevitable or whether he consciously positioned himself above other contenders in the family. Some argue that he simply inherited his role as eldest male in a powerful line. Others believe his quiet strategy and keen judgment set him apart, ensuring he became not just a successor, but a true leader. Many people still think that had he been less cautious, the Piromalli clan might have descended into violent feuds like so many others in Calabria. So what do you think? Was it fate? Or was it his deliberate restraint that preserved their dominance? By the end of the 1960s, Giuseppe had learned his bloodline's most sacred lesson: loyalty above all. The family was the shield and the sword, the anchor and the future. Those who betrayed it were cast out, sometimes permanently. Those who upheld it were rewarded with protection, wealth, and influence. Giuseppe, more than any of his peers, absorbed these lessons into his very being. The man who would one day be known as the Patriarch of Gioia Tauro began his journey not with violence, but with silence, patience, and the heavy burden of blood-bound loyalty. And as the industrial dreams of the state began to loom closer, Giuseppe already understood. His family's destiny was tied to the land, the port, and the unspoken code that demanded obedience without question. By the dawn of the 1970s, the Piromalli clan was no longer confined to the narrow alleys of Gioia Tauro. Their reach was stretching beyond small smuggling and into something broader, an organized expansion that reflected Giuseppe's steady hand. The world around Calabria was changing, and Giuseppe understood that the old trades could only carry the family so far. Cigarettes, livestock, and black market fuel had built a foundation, but now the opportunities were richer, riskier, and infinitely more profitable. The terrain of Calabria lent itself to clandestine enterprise. Rugged mountains, winding roads, and hidden valleys provided perfect cover for moving goods unseen. Giuseppe oversaw routes that threaded through these landscapes, connecting coastlines with inland hubs. Small fishing boats landed under moonlight, unloading not only cigarettes but also weapons and, increasingly, narcotics. Trucks made their way north, passing through checkpoints with papers already arranged. The Piromalli name had grown into a kind of shield. No officer eager for a long career looked too closely at their cargo. Mainstream historical records from this era show the 'Ndrangheta clans diversifying heavily. Beyond smuggling, they infiltrated construction and agriculture, industries that seemed mundane but offered steady cash flow. For the Piromallis, orange groves and olive presses became convenient covers. A warehouse full of fruit could just as easily conceal contraband, and a company shipping oil could balance books with both legitimate and illicit figures. Giuseppe oversaw these fronts with care, always insisting that the legal veneer remain spotless enough to discourage suspicion. One story from Gioia Tauro's market illustrates how deeply the clan's influence had penetrated daily life. A vendor refused to pay the small but compulsory fee to keep his stall open. Within days, his produce began rotting mysteriously overnight. No one else's goods were touched. The message was unmistakable. Protection wasn't optional. Giuseppe didn't need to lift a finger. The clan's structure ensured obedience. People quickly realized that survival meant cooperation. For Giuseppe, though, the expansion wasn't about petty intimidation. He envisioned something larger. The Piromalli family needed to step beyond Calabria's backwaters and integrate into global currents. He recognized that smuggling could evolve into international trafficking, that local construction firms could become conduits for laundering millions, and that the upcoming Gioia Tauro port was the key to unlocking it all. The kidnappings that plagued Italy in the 1970s provided both capital and fear. Wealthy businessmen from the industrial north vanished, only to reappear months later after ransoms were paid. Many of those victims were believed to have been hidden in Calabria's mountains, guarded by clans with ties to the Piromallis. Giuseppe's role was less about organizing the snatches than ensuring the money flowed through the right hands, funding their expansion. By the end of the decade, the Piromallis were no longer a regional clan. They were a powerhouse within the 'Ndrangheta. Giuseppe had a particular talent for building alliances. He cultivated relationships with neighboring families, not by boasting or threatening, but by demonstrating reliability. He paid when he promised, mediated disputes with fairness, and avoided unnecessary bloodshed. This earned him something rare in mafia circles: trust. Other bosses came to see him not just as a rival, but as a stabilizer, someone who could keep Calabria's violent landscape from descending into chaos. His nickname, the Patriarch, wasn't just about age or lineage. It reflected the respect he commanded across factions. There's an open scholarly debate about how much of Calabria's economic stagnation was caused by mafia infiltration during this era. Some argue that without clans like the Piromallis, state projects might have succeeded in revitalizing the South. Others counter that the mafia filled a void left by government neglect, providing jobs and stability, albeit under a dark shadow. Many people still think that Calabria was doomed to remain under mafia influence, no matter what reforms were attempted. So, what do you think? Was the clan a parasite draining progress, or a crude replacement for a failing state? One anecdote captures Giuseppe's approach. A relative recalled asking him why he invested so much effort into cultivating alliances rather than simply overpowering rivals. He replied, "A fortress with only one wall falls quickly. Build many walls, and you can rest." It was this philosophy that guided his expansion. Smuggling routes, construction contracts, unions, and eventually the port itself. Each was a wall, protecting the clan from collapse. humor sometimes pierced the heavy atmosphere. Locals joked that if you wanted to know whether a business in Gioia, Tauro was legitimate, you only had to ask, "Does Piromalli smile on it?" If yes, the business thrived. If no, the doors would close by month's end. It was a joke that carried truth, and even laughter held a note of fear. By the close of the 1970s, Giuseppe had transformed the Piromalli clan from a regional family into a dominant force with expanding tendrils. The Patriarch's authority stretched quietly through Calabria's economy, its politics, and its people. He had not yet revealed the full scope of his vision, but the groundwork was in place. The family's expansion was no longer about survival. It was about empire. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, Giuseppe Piromalli's vision sharpened. Expansion alone wasn't enough. To maintain it, he needed allies. The 'Ndrangheta was not one single entity, but a sprawling web of clans, each jealous of its turf, each fiercely protective of its independence. Survival demanded cooperation, and Giuseppe understood this better than most. While others drew pistols at the first insult, he extended his hand, preferring pacts over vendettas. The Piromalli clan began weaving themselves into a network of alliances that reached beyond Gioia Tauro. With calculated gestures, Giuseppe cultivated ties with the Mole family, neighbors whose influence was growing along the Tyrrhenian coast. Together, they could balance power, ensuring no single clan could overwhelm the other. Theirs was not a relationship without tension. Both families eyed the same riches, but Giuseppe's measured tone kept the peace. The Moles would become brothers in arms, allies in business, and at times rivals kept close enough to avoid disaster. Beyond Calabria, Giuseppe opened channels with other 'Ndrangheta families in Reggio Calabria, Vibo Valentia, and Catanzaro. He built bridges with the Mancuso family, with the Alvaro clan, with those whose reach extended into the mountains and the coasts. Each relationship was nurtured carefully, sealed not just by handshakes, but by marriages, baptisms, and the intertwining of bloodlines. To outsiders, a wedding was a joyful occasion. To Giuseppe, it was also a boardroom where alliances were cemented over wine and dance. One historical fact stands out here. In the late 1970s, the 'Ndrangheta began formalizing its structure, echoing the Sicilian Cosa Nostra's commission. They developed their own form of a ruling body, a cupola, designed to mediate disputes and coordinate strategies across clans. Giuseppe's growing reputation as a man of patience and fairness earned him a respected seat in these discussions. He was not just a regional patriarch anymore. He was becoming a voice in the broader symphony of organized crime in southern Italy. Giuseppe had a gift for subtle diplomacy. He avoided flamboyance, never dressing like a movie gangster, never flaunting wealth. He presented himself as a modest Calabrian elder, a man who respected traditions and valued order. This demeanor reassured allies and disarmed rivals. When disputes erupted between clans, over territory, over contracts, over wounded pride, Giuseppe often served as mediator. He rarely raised his voice, but when he spoke, men listened. His authority was not enforced with theatrics, but with quiet certainty. There is a story told of a tense meeting between two rival families arguing over control of a lucrative construction contract. Tempers flared, fists clenched, and the room quivered on the edge of violence. Giuseppe simply tapped the table with his finger and said, "If blood is spilled, the contract disappears for both of you." The room fell silent. The rivals glared but yielded. The patriarch had spoken, and his word carried the weight of inevitability. Of course, Not everyone welcomed Giuseppe's style. Some younger men in the 'Ndrangheta mocked his caution, preferring the swagger of bold hits and spectacular shows of dominance. But time proved him right. Many of those brash figures were cut down in vendettas, leaving their families weakened. Giuseppe endured. His patience was his armor, his diplomacy, his blade. Scholars continue to debate whether these alliances were motivated purely by survival or by an ambition to create a united Calabrian front against the Sicilian Cosa Nostra. Some argue that Giuseppe saw the writing on the wall, that Sicily's dominance could only be countered by Calabrian unity. Others claim he was less visionary and more pragmatic, simply ensuring his family's survival. Many people still think that his alliances were both shield and sword, carefully positioned to protect the Piromalli clan while nudging Calabria toward cohesion. So what do you think? Was he a strategist with a grand design, or merely a cautious patriarch defending his turf? Despite his preference for peace, Giuseppe was no fool. He knew alliances only held as long as profits flowed and respect remained intact. He instructed his men to always keep a ledger, literal or mental, of debts and favors. If another clan asked for help in smuggling, a favor was recorded. If a rival needed a dispute mediated, another favor was noted. Giuseppe built not only alliances, but a balance sheet of obligations that gave him leverage when the time came. There was even humor in his dealings. At one meeting, when a rival suggested dividing profits unevenly in his favor, Giuseppe smiled thinly and said, "Then I will take the smaller half, provided I choose which half that is." The room erupted in nervous laughter, but the message was clear. He would not be cheated. By the early 1980s, Giuseppe's alliances formed a protective web. The Piromalli family was no longer a single stronghold, but a nexus connected to dozens of others. Rivals respected him, allies leaned on him, and the state increasingly realized that behind every contract and union dispute in Gioia, Tauro, the Patriarch's hand was guiding the outcome. His diplomacy had given the clan resilience and reach that bullets alone could never buy, and so, the Piromallis advanced not as reckless raiders, but as architects of quiet power, with Giuseppe at the helm, an elder statesman in a world where most men never lived long enough to grow old. Giuseppe Piromalli's transformation from heir to leader unfolded gradually. But by the time the 1980s settled over Calabria, his authority was no longer in doubt. He had become the undisputed patriarch of the clan, and his presence defined Gioia Tauro. When people referred to Il Vecchio, the old man, they weren't simply speaking about age. They were acknowledging a quiet force whose influence touched every corner of the town. Giuseppe's authority rested not in spectacle, but in certainty. He was the man whose word was final, whose decisions carried weight not because he shouted them, but because he rarely needed to repeat himself. His family and associates knew that disobedience was unthinkable. A nod from him could redirect contracts, a gesture could calm tempers, and a single visit to his home was enough to remind even the proudest politician or businessman that the patriarch was watching. The way he cultivated authority was deliberate. Giuseppe embraced the old Calabrian ideals of respect, dignity, and discretion. He kept his home simple, avoiding ostentatious displays of wealth. Unlike Sicilian dons who sometimes flaunted riches, Piromalli preferred to appear almost austere. This created a paradoxical aura. Outsiders underestimated him at first, while insiders recognized that his restraint was calculated. The less he displayed, the more he seemed to possess. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize how the 'Ndrangheta's strength lay in family bonds and the concealment of leadership. Giuseppe embodied both. He rarely appeared in public as a boss. Instead, he lived as though he were a respected elder statesman, blending into community life. He attended weddings, funerals, baptisms, and Sunday masses like any other villager. But everyone knew his seat in the church pew carried more weight than any elected official's chair. One anecdote captures this authority perfectly. During a tense union dispute at the port construction site, workers threatened to strike over pay delays. Politicians scrambled. Company managers panicked. But Giuseppe quietly invited the union leader to his home. The man arrived tense, expecting threats. Instead, he found Giuseppe sipping espresso, speaking softly. "If your men strike now, they will suffer tomorrow. If they work today, tomorrow's bread will be doubled." The next morning, the strike was called off. No violence, no public confrontation, just the Patriarch's logic, spoken with unhurried certainty. His ability to mediate was one reason his reputation spread across Calabria. Other clans sought his counsel not because he was the loudest, but because he was the most consistent. In a world where vendettas often spiraled into decades of bloodshed, Giuseppe offered something rare: stability. He could balance rivalries, weigh disputes, and prevent explosions that would draw the attention of the state. His authority was not only feared, it was relied upon. But make no mistake, his calm exterior masked a steel will. Those who mistook his silence for weakness paid dearly. There are whispered stories of men who tried to defy him, refusing to pay or ignoring his authority. Their businesses collapsed overnight, contracts evaporated, and families found themselves shunned by the very community they depended on. In Calabria, exile from the social fabric could be as deadly as a bullet. Giuseppe knew this, and he wielded that social exile as a weapon sharper than knives. There's a scholarly debate about whether Giuseppe's rise to undisputed patriarch was a product of his own brilliance or the natural inheritance of his bloodline. Many people still think that he would have risen regardless, simply because the Piromalli family was destined to dominate Gioia Tauro. Others argue that without his personal restraint and intelligence, the family might have fractured like so many others. So what do you think? Was his leadership born of blood or forged by his choices? Even as he tightened his authority, Giuseppe remained careful to shield himself from direct exposure. Associates handled contracts, nephews supervised operations, and allies managed unions. He operated through layers, distancing himself from the day-to-day crimes. If investigators came asking, there was little to connect him directly to anything. Like a spider in the center of a web, he pulled the strands invisibly, leaving the outer edges to bear the risk. Yet within his family circle, he made his presence unmistakable. At dinners, his chair was the unspoken throne. No one sat before he did. No one spoke too long without glancing his way. When he laughed, a rare, dry chuckle, the room relaxed. When he frowned, the air itself seemed heavier. His role as patriarch was not theatrical, but elemental. In Gioia Tauro, his authority was like gravity, unseen, constant, and impossible to resist. By the early 1990s, Giuseppe Piromalli stood not just as a mafia boss, but as a figure who defined his region's rhythm. To cross him was to cross Calabria's very heartbeat. And though the state believed it was building a new economic gateway at Gioia Tauro, the truth was simpler. Nothing passed through those cranes, containers, or contracts without the patriarch's shadow lying across it first. Calabria in the 1970s and 1980s was haunted by kidnappings. Across Italy, wealthy industrialists, aristocrats, and sometimes even their children disappeared into the night. The victims were often whisked south, hidden in Calabria's mountains, guarded in caves or farmhouses where outsiders would never dare to look. For the 'Ndrangheta, these kidnappings were more than a side hustle. They were a financial engine. And for Giuseppe Piromalli, they became a vital fuel to power the expansion of his family's empire. Mainstream historical records estimate that in just 2 decades, the Calabrian clans earned hundreds of millions of lire from kidnappings. Families in the north paid enormous sums to see their loved ones released, sometimes after months of captivity. Ransom money flowed down into Calabria like a river, and much of it ended up in the hands of clans like the Piromalli. Unlike hot-headed kidnappers who squandered their share on cars and guns, Giuseppe treated ransom as capital. He reinvested it into construction firms, shipping companies, political favors, and eventually into the port of Gioia Tauro itself. This was where Giuseppe's genius showed. He didn't see kidnapping as the end, but as the means to something much larger. While rival bosses flaunted their ransom money in reckless feasts or feuds, Giuseppe folded the cash neatly into long-term strategies. He understood that Gioia Tauro's industrial future needed liquidity, and kidnappings, as brutal as they were, provided it. It was ruthless pragmatism at its coldest. The fear of northern Italy became the concrete of Calabria. Locals in Gioia Tauro had a complicated relationship with these kidnappings. On one hand, they whispered about the cruelty of abducting children from wealthy families. On the other, they saw the ransom money building businesses, hiring local workers, and circulating in a region otherwise abandoned by the state. The paradox was sharp. Economic survival built on someone else's terror. For Giuseppe, morality was never the question. The only question was control. Control of the money, control of the outcomes, control of the narrative. One anecdote tells of a young man from a neighboring clan who grew too greedy during a ransom division. He demanded a larger cut, threatening to pull his men from future operations. Giuseppe, calm as ever, invited him to dinner. Over a plate of pasta, the Patriarch simply said, "A man who asks for too much today leaves nothing for tomorrow." By dessert, the young man had agreed to the original terms. It was typical Giuseppe, never raising his voice, never threatening outright, but bending wills with quiet logic. Scholars debate whether the kidnappings were merely tolerated by Giuseppe or directly orchestrated under his command. Many people still think he deliberately kept his hands clean, allowing allies and associates to handle the rough details while he focused on where the money flowed. So what do you think? Was he a mastermind of abduction, or a strategist who simply capitalized on the blood-soaked profits? The Italian state, of course, noticed. Special anti-kidnapping units were formed, and laws were tightened to freeze ransom money before it could be used. But Calabria was not easily penetrated. The mountains provided cover, the families provided silence, and the Piromalli clan provided discipline. Investigations often ended in dead ends, with locals denying knowledge, witnesses evaporating, and victims released without ever seeing the men who held them. By the mid-1980s, kidnappings began to decline, not because the clans grew squeamish, but because they had already achieved their purpose. With Gioia Tauro's port project gathering momentum, Giuseppe no longer needed such crude methods to finance his empire. The ransom millions had served their role, laying the groundwork for construction contracts, business fronts, and influence that reached into Rome. The Patriarch had turned temporary terror into lasting infrastructure. Humor, dark as it was, sometimes circulated among locals. They joked that in Calabria, the only tourists who stayed too long were the ones who didn't come voluntarily. Even Giuseppe, in private, was said to have chuckled at the grim wit, though he quickly reminded his nephews that laughter did not excuse recklessness. Every operation had to serve the larger vision, or it was wasted energy. By the time the last high-profile kidnappings ended, the Piromalli clan had already shifted gears. They no longer needed ransom as their lifeline. They had contracts, unions, and international shipping lanes on the horizon. The Patriarch's empire was maturing, and with it, Gioia Tauro was stepping onto the global stage, its cranes rising like steel sentinels under a sky that hid centuries of silence. The dream of Gioia Tauro's port had been brewing for decades, but by the late 1980s, it was finally taking shape. Massive cranes rose against the Calabrian skyline, steel arms stretching toward the sea. Concrete yards spread outward like a giant's chessboard, and the small fishing town began to transform into something far larger. For the Italian government, the port represented modernization, an industrial future for the neglected South. For Giuseppe Piromalli, it represented destiny. Giuseppe had seen the potential long before most. The world was shifting to containerized shipping, those uniform steel boxes that could carry anything from televisions to cocaine. Whoever controlled a port capable of handling them didn't just control docks, they controlled trade itself. And in Calabria, the Patriarch ensured that no container could arrive or leave without his quiet blessing. Mainstream historical accounts describe Gioia Tauro as one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of its time. Billions were invested to make it Europe's largest container port. On paper, it was an economic miracle. In practice, the Piromalli clan, under Giuseppe's guidance, ensured the project was entangled in mafia networks from the very beginning. Contracts went to companies tied to the family, unions bent to their influence, and politicians quickly learned that promises made in Rome meant little if the Patriarch's nod was missing in Gioia Tauro. Construction firms were particularly vulnerable. Many wanted a piece of the lucrative port work, but without Piromalli approval, machines mysteriously broke, materials vanished, or workers refused to show up. The Patriarch didn't need to storm sites or shout threats. His authority was implied in every delay, every whisper, every sudden mishap. It became an open secret. To build at Gioia Tauro, you built with Piromalli's permission. One story tells of a company from northern Italy that won a major contract but resisted paying fees. For weeks, their work slowed. Cement deliveries arrived spoiled, trucks broke down en route, and local suppliers refused cooperation. Finally, the manager received a polite phone call. A voice simply said, "The Patriarch doesn't like unfinished projects." Within days, the company adjusted its accounts, and suddenly the cement was fresh, the trucks ran smoothly, and suppliers smiled again. This subtle control was Giuseppe's hallmark. He avoided the flamboyance of Sicilian dons who boasted of their dominance. Instead, he positioned himself as indispensable, a man whose oversight kept the wheels turning. Politicians and businessmen came to see him less as a threat and more as a partner, albeit one they dared not refuse. But behind the facade of economic progress lay darker currents. The port was an open gateway, not only for legitimate cargo, but also for narcotics. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Gioia Tauro became one of Europe's prime entry points for cocaine. Colombian cartels found eager partners in the 'Ndrangheta, and the Piromallis ensured containers filled with white powder slipped through under the cover of steel and paperwork. Scholars often debate whether the Italian state underestimated the mafia's ability to infiltrate the port, or simply tolerated it, fearing the collapse of an already fragile project. Many people still think that without the Piromalli clan's involvement, the port would never have functioned at all, that their grip, however dark, provided the efficiency the state lacked. So what do you think? Did the mafia ruin Gioia Tauro, or did they paradoxically make it work? For Giuseppe, such questions were irrelevant. He saw the port as his crowning achievement, the culmination of patience and strategy. The ransom money from kidnappings, the smuggling profits, the political alliances, all of it funneled into this single project. He did not need to own the port outright. He needed only to ensure it could not move without him. And by the early 1990s, that goal was realized. Locals joked in hushed tones that if you wanted to find out which containers belonged to Piromalli, you didn't check manifests. You simply looked for the ones that always sailed through customs without delay. Even the cranes seemed to bow to the Patriarch's will. In the twilight hours, as the sea breeze carried the smell of salt and fuel, Giuseppe sometimes sat on his terrace overlooking Gioia Tauro. To an outsider, he might have seemed like any other elderly Calabrian man enjoying the evening. But in truth, he was watching his empire materialize. Steel, concrete, and containers standing as monuments to his foresight. The port was no longer just Italy's project. It was his legacy. Cement was more than stone and mortar in Calabria. It was currency, it was control. And in the 1980s and 1990s, it became the quiet empire of Giuseppe Piromalli. As Gioia Tauro's port expanded, every slab poured, every crane anchored, every warehouse built required cement. And cement in Calabria was never simply ordered. It was allocated, approved, and blessed by the clan. Construction was the Patriarch's masterpiece of infiltration. Through front companies and loyal associates, the Piromalli family gained leverage over suppliers. Cement factories, trucking firms, and small subcontractors all found themselves tied to the clan's web. If you wanted materials on time, you dealt with Piromalli men. If you wanted your equipment to remain intact, you paid what was expected. The state called it extortion. Locals called it insurance. But Giuseppe saw it as management, a way of keeping chaos at bay. Mainstream history confirms that billions poured into southern Italy through public works projects in this era, much of it meant for industrial development. Yet a staggering percentage was siphoned away through corruption and mafia infiltration. For Gioia Tauro, the numbers tell the story. A project envisioned as the crown jewel of the Mezzogiorno instead became one of the most notorious examples of organized crime profiting from development funds. And at the heart of it all stood the Piromallis, with Giuseppe orchestrating contracts as carefully as a conductor leads a symphony. Politicians were indispensable allies. Local councilors and mayors soon discovered that their careers were smoother with Piromalli support. Campaign donations appeared when they were most needed. Voter turnout in certain neighborhoods could be guided. In exchange, oversight of construction projects softened, inspections passed with ease, and permits flowed without obstacles. Giuseppe never needed to bribe openly. He simply made sure cooperation benefited everyone, at least everyone who didn't resist. One story from this period tells of a newly elected mayor who attempted to block a suspiciously inflated construction contract. Days later, he found his office mysteriously flooded from a burst pipe. His home received anonymous calls at night. And at Sunday Mass, he noticed parishioners quietly avoiding eye contact. Within weeks, he reversed his decision. No threats were ever issued. The pressure was invisible, yet suffocating. Giuseppe didn't need to lift a finger. His reputation did the work for him. To his family, cement was a gold mine. Every contract was skimmed, every truckload accounted for, every delay calculated. Younger men joked that their fortune wasn't in blood, but in concrete dust. Even Giuseppe allowed a dry smile when one nephew remarked, "Uncle, our true business is stone." He replied, "Stone lasts longer than men." Remember that. Scholars today debate the exact percentage of the port's construction controlled by the clan. Some say nearly every contract bore mafia fingerprints. Others suggest that while corruption was rampant, the state still managed to assert some authority. Many people still think that without the Piromallis, construction would have stalled completely, that their iron grip, however parasitic, paradoxically kept the wheels turning. So what do you think? Were they parasites draining the port, or the hidden gears that made it function? Meanwhile, money laundering expanded. Hotels, transport companies, and warehouses sprouted like mushrooms across Calabria. On the surface, they appeared legitimate, providing jobs to locals. But beneath the surface, they were perfect funnels for illicit profits. Giuseppe's genius lay not just in seizing wealth, but in making it appear ordinary. By the time investigators traced funds, they were buried under layers of invoices, subcontractors, and offshore accounts. And yet, despite his empire, the Patriarch maintained a facade of modesty. He continued to dress simply, live quietly, and avoid the flashy trappings of power. To see him walking through town was to see an elder statesman, perhaps even a grandfatherly figure. But everyone knew, every brick, every bag of cement, every paycheck connected to Gioia Tauro carried his invisible seal. At night, when the floodlights of the port illuminated the rising structures, Giuseppe was said to stand on his balcony, watching the cement mixers and cranes from afar. To neighbors, he looked like an old man enjoying progress. In truth, he was surveying a kingdom built not of castles or crowns, but of contracts, cement, and silence. Family was everything in Calabria, but in the Piromalli clan, family was not just blood, it was infrastructure. Giuseppe Piromalli understood that his empire depended on more than smuggling routes, port contracts, and cement monopolies. It depended on a hierarchy as rigid as the church pews in Gioia Tauro's cathedral. And that hierarchy was enforced in council meetings that were as solemn as any mass, where loyalty was demanded and obedience tested. The family council was both ritual and theater. Men gathered in discreet houses, often around a long wooden table, with coffee cups cooling while the true business began. Giuseppe would sit at the head, never raising his voice, yet commanding the room with a steady presence. The younger men leaned forward, eager to prove themselves, while the older ones measured words carefully. Every decision was framed as collective, but everyone knew the Patriarch's will was the current guiding the river. Omerta, the code of silence, was never simply recited. It was lived. Before young men were trusted with real responsibilities, they were tested. Sometimes it was as small as keeping a trivial secret. Other times it was watching how they reacted when questioned by strangers. Only those who passed earned a seat at the table. Giuseppe made sure that loyalty wasn't assumed just because of blood. It had to be demonstrated. Historical accounts of the 'Ndrangheta reveal how deeply ritualized these councils were. Unlike the Sicilian mafia's rigid hierarchy, the Calabrian clans prided themselves on being federations of families, each tied by blood, marriage, and shared ceremony. Titles like capobastone, The boss, contabile, the treasurer, and crimine, the arbiter, weren't mere labels. They were roles that bound men to responsibility. Giuseppe embodied the capobastone role, but he blurred the line between symbolic authority and real power. He made the family council feel sacred, but he also ensured it was efficient, a place where strategy replaced chaos. One story told by locals involves a nephew who arrived late to a council meeting, shrugging it off with youthful arrogance. Giuseppe listened quietly, then leaned forward and said, "If you can't arrive on time for me, how will you arrive on time for God?" The young man never arrived late again. It was not the words themselves, but the tone, firm, calm, almost paternal, that cut deeper than threats ever could. The atmosphere in those gatherings was tense but respectful. Men spoke in low tones, careful not to overstep, careful not to challenge directly. When disputes arose over territory, profits, or loyalty, Giuseppe let others talk first. He waited, listening with that deliberate patience that unnerved even seasoned lieutenants. Only when silence fell did he deliver his decision, and once he spoke, the matter was closed. There were no appeals. Sometimes, the meetings involved symbolic acts. A debt might be forgiven in exchange for a vow of service. A betrayal might be punished not with violence in the room, but with a silent nod that sealed a man's fate elsewhere. Those gestures carried more weight than gunfire because they made clear that every choice was remembered, every loyalty rewarded, every betrayal marked. Scholars still debate how much of the 'Ndrangheta's strength came from such councils. Many people still think that it was precisely this family-based ritual, so unlike the more formalized structures of Sicily or Naples, that allowed Calabria's clans to survive police crackdowns. So what do you think? Was ritual a shield against collapse, or merely a mask hiding the brutality underneath? Humor sometimes flickered at the edges. One elder is said to have joked, "We argue here longer than priests argue in confession." Even Giuseppe allowed a brief chuckle, but he always redirected the room back to order. For him, laughter had its place, but discipline never loosened. Outside, ordinary Calabrians felt the impact of these councils even if they never saw them. A shopkeeper suddenly found himself paying a new fee. A contractor discovered he had won a contract he hadn't bid for. A family feud mysteriously ended after decades. All of these ripples traced back to decisions made in those smoke-filled rooms where the Patriarch presided. And so, the family council was not merely a meeting of criminals. It was the Parliament of Gioia Tauro, the unseen government where obedience was taught, where rituals bound men tighter than chains, and where Giuseppe Piromalli's authority was reaffirmed again and again, not through rage, but through the still, immovable weight of his silence. By the early 1980s, the Italian state had begun to notice what had long been obvious to everyone in Gioia Tauro. The Piromalli clan was not just a family, but an institution. The wealth funneled through construction, smuggling, and port contracts caught the eye of investigators. And so, for the first time, the state struck directly at Giuseppe Piromalli. Arrests were carried out, trials scheduled, and prosecutors spoke loudly of cutting off the mafia's grip on Calabria. But the Patriarch had anticipated this moment for years, and he met it not with panic, but with the same calm that had defined his rise. The first wave of arrests disrupted operations only briefly. Associates stepped in, nephews covered responsibilities, and allies in unions and councils ensured contracts continued. The Patriarch had built his empire with layers, so many layers that cutting one cord left dozens intact. Investigators complained that while they could detain men and seize trucks, the money trails always vanished into a fog of front companies, forged invoices, and political shields. Mainstream historical records confirm that despite several high-profile investigations in the 1980s, the Piromalli clan retained extraordinary influence. Anti-mafia magistrates in Calabria were under-resourced compared to their counterparts in Sicily, and the 'Ndrangheta's tight family bonds made infiltrations rare. While the Sicilian mafia was shaken by pentiti, turncoats who testified, Calabria saw far fewer defectors. Giuseppe's iron discipline ensured that silence held firm. One anecdote illustrates the futility of these early state efforts. A prosecutor once boasted publicly that he would dismantle the Piromalli empire within a year. Locals chuckled. Within months, the prosecutor's investigation stalled, witnesses retracted statements, and contractors swore they had never paid bribes. The prosecutor was reassigned soon after. In Gioia, Tauro, people shook their heads knowingly. The Patriarch had not needed to lift a finger. The system itself had bent. When Giuseppe himself was finally detained for questioning, he remained inscrutable. He answered politely, offered nothing, and returned to his cell with the serenity of a man on holiday. Guards noticed his composure. He read newspapers, sipped coffee, and wrote letters that, though monitored, never contained incriminating words. His silence was more powerful than testimony. His men knew what that silence meant. Stay quiet, stay loyal, wait. There is debate among scholars as to whether Giuseppe truly masterminded the ability to operate even behind bars, or whether his family simply filled the gap instinctively. Many people still think that his genius lay in building a structure so self-sustaining that his physical presence was almost unnecessary. So, what do you think? Was it the Patriarch's brilliance, or the inertia of a clan too deeply rooted to be uprooted? Even in confinement, his influence seeped beyond the prison walls. Visitors, family, lawyers, priests, carried subtle instructions. A phrase, a nod, an offhand remark could translate into orders that reshaped contracts or calmed disputes back in Gioia, Tauro. Officials knew it, but proving it was impossible. Every conversation seemed mundane, every gesture ordinary. Yet outside, construction resumed smoothly. Port deals advanced, and rivals stayed in line. The Patriarch treated prison not as defeat, but as an extension of his strategy. He compared it to Calabria's old farmers, who left their fields fallow for a season, letting the soil recover before planting again. His absence only deepened the aura around him. In Gioia Tauro, people whispered more reverently about Il Vecchio now that he was behind bars. His legend grew stronger, not weaker. Humor even flickered in the gloom. One guard recalled Giuseppe asking him, with a dry smile, whether the prison kitchen could make espresso as strong as the cafes in Gioia Tauro. The guard laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke or a quiet assertion that even behind walls, Giuseppe carried Calabria with him. The state strikes were loud, but Giuseppe's resilience was louder in its silence. Arrests came and went, prosecutors rotated, but the Patriarch endured, unbroken. His clan operated as though nothing had changed, because in truth, little had. The web he spun reached far beyond bars, woven so tightly into Calabria's society that no single raid could cut it apart. By the time the 1980s closed, the message was clear. The state could detain the man, but it could not detain the system. Giuseppe Piromalli remained the Patriarch of Gioia Tauro, whether walking free under the Calabrian sun or confined behind iron bars. Giuseppe Piromalli's power did not rest solely on fear, it rested on calculation. By the late 1980s, vendettas burned across Calabria as rival families settled old debts with blood. Streets in Reggio Calabria saw shootouts. Villages mourned sons felled in feuds, and the newspapers filled with grim headlines about bodies left in orchards or burned cars on back roads. But while others drowned in vengeance, Giuseppe took a different path. He understood that survival depended not on endless wars, but on the ability to step around them. In meetings, when lieutenants pressed for retaliation, Giuseppe would lean back, sip his coffee, and let silence stretch. Finally, in his measured tone, he would say, "A war feeds no one." It wasn't weakness, it was strategy. His philosophy was clear. Vendettas drain resources, attract police, and shatter alliances. By refusing to indulge in reckless violence, he positioned the Piromalli clan as an island of stability in a sea of chaos. Mainstream historical records highlight this difference. Whereas Sicilian Cosa Nostra bosses often waged spectacular wars that drew global attention, the 'Ndrangheta thrived in part because clans like the Piromallis avoided unnecessary conflict. They built alliances, traded favors, and created a system that resembled diplomacy more than open warfare. Giuseppe, with his calm voice and iron patience, embodied this approach. One famous episode involved tensions with the Mancuso family, who sought a larger slice of drug trafficking routes passing through Calabria. Hot-headed figures in the Piromalli clan wanted immediate retaliation after a skirmish left 2 men wounded. Giuseppe refused. Instead, he arranged a dinner, inviting both sides to sit at a long table heavy with food and wine. Throughout the evening, he said little, letting others argue. At the end, he raised his glass and stated, "If we quarrel here, Rome takes our bread tomorrow." The room fell silent. The Mancusos backed down. Not a bullet was fired, and trade continued. There's an open scholarly debate about whether Giuseppe's patience was altruism or cold pragmatism. Many people still think that he avoided bloodshed not to spare lives, but to preserve profits, recognizing that stability was more valuable than revenge. So what do you think? Was he a peacemaker in disguise, or merely a businessman protecting his investments? His diplomacy extended even to the Sicilian mafia. Palermo's bosses, especially in the 1980s, were notorious for flamboyance and brutal vendettas. Giuseppe kept his distance, preferring cooperation to rivalry. When drug shipments passed from South America into Sicily and then on to Calabria, he ensured that profit was shared smoothly. "We do not need the world to know our names," he reportedly told an associate. "We need the world to pass through our doors." It was a philosophy that contrasted sharply with Cosa Nostra's hunger for notoriety. Still, Giuseppe was not blind. He knew peace had limits. Rival clans like the Moles, his closest allies and occasional competitors, simmered with ambition. Disputes over union control or port contracts threatened to ignite violence more than once. But Giuseppe's presence acted as ballast. His calm authority, his ability to wait longer than any opponent, kept tensions simmering rather than boiling. Among his men, his patience became legendary. They joked that the Patriarch could outweight the mountains themselves. One lieutenant remarked, "If you argued with him, you ended up agreeing just because the silence was heavier than your words." Even humor underscored the truth. Giuseppe wielded patience as a weapon sharper than knives, and yet, beneath this diplomacy lay steel. When absolutely necessary, the Patriarch authorized decisive action. Betrayal was not tolerated. Those who broke omertà or skimmed profits learned quickly that Giuseppe's restraint did not mean forgiveness. His justice was swift, but always cloaked. Accidents, disappearances, sudden misfortunes that never linked back to him. Violence was the last resort, but it was never off the table. The balance he maintained made Gioia Tauro unique. While other Calabrian towns reeled from vendettas, Gioia Tauro moved forward with contracts, port cranes, and a sense of eerie stability. To locals, it seemed almost as if the Patriarch had struck a pact with fate itself, peace in exchange for silence, prosperity in exchange for obedience. By the early 1990s, Giuseppe's reputation as Calabria's calmest yet most unyielding patriarch was sealed. He had demonstrated that power could be maintained without constant bloodshed, that patience could be as terrifying as violence, and that in the quiet corridors of Gioia Tauro, the Patriarch's shadow loomed heavier than the sound of any gunfire. The unions at Gioia Tauro were meant to represent the working men, the dockers, and the laborers who would sweat under the Mediterranean sun, unloading containers and driving cranes. But in Calabria, nothing of such importance could remain untouched by the invisible hand of the 'Ndrangheta. For Giuseppe Piromalli, control of the unions was not about ideology, it was about leverage. Whoever controlled the unions controlled strikes, wages, contracts, and, by extension, the heartbeat of the port itself. The Patriarch approached union control the same way he approached everything, with patience, subtlety, and quiet authority. Instead of storming meetings with threats, he placed trusted men inside the structures. Cousins, nephews, or loyal associates became delegates and representatives, elected with ease because they carried both the respect of workers and the unspoken endorsement of the clan. Once inside, they shaped decisions with the lightest of touches. A raised eyebrow in a council meeting, a subtle suggestion during a vote, and outcomes always bent toward Piromalli interests. Mainstream historical records describe how the 'Ndrangheta embedded itself in southern Italian unions during the 1980s and 1990s. Strikes could be triggered or diffused at will. Companies that resisted mafia influence often found themselves paralyzed by sudden labor disputes, while those who cooperated enjoyed smooth operations. For Gioia Tauro, this meant the Piromalli clan could choke or free the port like a valve, ensuring no shipment moved without their implicit consent. One anecdote is often whispered in Gioia Tauro. When a shipping company resisted paying fees, dock workers suddenly launched a strike over safety concerns. Containers piled up, ships idled, and losses mounted. The company, desperate, received a discreet visit from a man who offered a solution: pay what was due, and the safety issue would resolve itself. Within 24 hours, the strike ended, workers returned, and the ships sailed on schedule. The Patriarch didn't need to issue threats. The unions themselves became his instrument. Giuseppe's genius lay in understanding that workers weren't just pawns. They were the lifeblood of the port. He ensured they received enough wages, enough stability, and enough pride in their jobs to remain loyal. They might grumble about conditions, but they knew that with the Patriarch's oversight, there was food on their tables. Many ordinary men believed, perhaps sincerely, that he looked out for them in a way the distant state never did. This blurred the line between oppression and protection. To the Italian state, Giuseppe was extorting labor. To many dock workers, he was guaranteeing their livelihoods. As one local once put it, Rome talks of rights, but Piromalli makes sure I get paid. There's a scholarly debate about whether this dynamic made the workers complicit or simply resigned. Many people still think the unions in Gioia Tauro became less about labor rights and more about a parallel system of governance, with the Patriarch acting as an invisible employer. So what do you think? Were the workers victims of mafia control or participants in a system that kept bread on their tables? In private council meetings, Giuseppe emphasized the importance of keeping workers calm. "A hungry man is dangerous," he would tell his lieutenants. "A man with wages is loyal." Strikes were tools, not weapons. They could punish disobedient companies, but they could also reward those who cooperated by ensuring labor peace. It was the carrot and the stick, seamlessly merged. Occasionally, younger men in the clan grew impatient, wanting to use unions as blunt instruments for intimidation. Giuseppe corrected them sharply. "Fear fades," he said once, "but respect endures when the table is never empty." He understood that lasting control came not from terrorizing workers, but from weaving them into the clan's fabric of obedience and gratitude. Humor wasn't absent, even here. Workers joked among themselves that their union rep answered to two bosses, one in the office and one in the shadows. A laugh shared nervously, because everyone knew which boss really mattered. By the early 1990s, control of the unions ensured that Giuseppe's hand rested firmly on the throat of Gioia Tauro's economy. No strike happened without his nod. No labor peace lasted without his approval. The Patriarch didn't just rule over contracts and construction. He ruled over the rhythm of work itself, the sweat of men, the clang of containers, and the pulse of a port that now danced to his timing. By the mid-1980s, Calabria was swept into a new current, the cocaine trade. What had once been smuggling of cigarettes and contraband fuel now seemed like child's play compared to the rivers of profit flowing from South America. And Gioia Tauro, with its rising cranes and endless containers, was the perfect gateway. Giuseppe Piromalli, always cautious, always deliberate, recognized the shift before others did. He saw that drugs, not kidnappings or cement alone, would define the next era of power. The Patriarch never presented himself as a drug lord. He was too careful for that. To neighbors, he remained the quiet elder, walking slowly through town, sipping his coffee, nodding respectfully to priests. But behind the facade, his family's network grew more entangled with international cartels. Colombian traffickers, hungry for reliable European partners, found in the 'Ndrangheta something the Sicilian mafia could not always guarantee: family loyalty so strong that betrayal was nearly impossible. And among the Calabrians, few families had the organizational discipline of the Piromallis. Containers arriving at Gioia Tauro carried more than televisions and shoes. Hidden in the shadows of legitimate cargo were bricks of cocaine, camouflaged under paperwork so tidy that inspectors rarely questioned it. Customs officers, already underpaid and overwhelmed, faced pressure not only from mountains of cargo, but from the invisible weight of omertà. The message was clear: check another container, leave this one sealed. And in the rare cases when inspections did occur, crates arrived clean, because the Patriarch ensured that the real shipments moved elsewhere under cover of distraction. Mainstream historical studies confirm that by the late 1980s, Gioia Tauro had become one of Europe's busiest cocaine entry points. The Calabrian clans, working closely with Colombian cartels, bypassed Sicilian intermediaries and established direct trade routes. The Piromallis, alongside allies like the Mole, were central players. Their control of the port infrastructure meant that shipments passed smoothly, profits soared, and the cocaine business became an empire unto itself. One story whispered among investigators involves a single container misplaced at Gioia, Tauro. When customs finally located it days later, the contents had been swapped out. An entire load of cocaine vanished, replaced with mundane goods. No one could explain how, and no one was punished. Locals smiled grimly, knowing the answer but never daring to say it aloud. The Patriarch had willed it so. Within the clan, Giuseppe remained measured. He instructed his men not to flaunt wealth from the drug trade. Money that shouts draws guns, he told them. The profits were enormous, but they were to be folded back into construction, hotels, transport firms, and land. Laundering wasn't just an afterthought. It was a parallel business, ensuring the family's empire grew both visible and invisible at once. Scholars debate whether Giuseppe personally orchestrated the cocaine trade or whether younger Piromalli members handled the details while he acted as overseer. Many people still think that his genius was precisely in this delegation, keeping his fingerprints off the product while ensuring every euro passed through his ledger. So what do you think? Was he the architect of the drug routes, or the quiet patriarch who allowed younger blood to take the risks while he reaped the rewards? Despite the seriousness of the trade, dark humor circulated among dock workers. They joked that Gioia Tauro had two types of containers, ones full of goods and ones full of good times. The laughter was nervous, but it masked an unspoken reality. Everyone knew, yet no one dared to speak. By the early 1990s, the cocaine rivers had cemented the Piromalli clan's dominance. Ransom money had built the foundations, cement had funded expansion, and politics had secured contracts. But drugs brought the kind of wealth that turned a regional clan into an international powerhouse. And through it all, Giuseppe Piromalli, the quiet patriarch, guided the current like a helmsman steering a ship into darker, deeper waters. By the early 1990s, the cranes at Gioia Tauro's port finally began to swing with purpose, their long arms hoisting containers from ships that sailed in from every corner of the globe. What had once been dusty construction sites transformed into a humming hub of international trade. To outsiders, it looked like progress at last for Calabria, a region long starved of industry. But to Giuseppe Piromalli, it was something else. The realization of decades of patience, strategy, and quiet maneuvering. The port wasn't just concrete and steel. It was his empire, cloaked in legitimacy. From the first shipments, whispers confirmed what everyone already suspected. Nothing moved through Gioia Tauro without the patriarch's shadow touching it. Shipping companies seeking efficiency discovered that a few discreet payments guaranteed smooth unloading. Union leaders who might have threatened strikes stayed calm, their pockets lined and their men reassured. Even customs inspectors, overworked and under pressure, learned to glance at certain containers and wave them through. The invisible order of the port was not Rome's or Brussels. It was Giuseppe's. Mainstream historical records describe Gioia Tauro as quickly becoming one of the busiest container ports in the Mediterranean. At its peak, millions of containers passed through each year. But while official reports celebrated statistics, investigators soon realized the port had also become Europe's most important entry point for cocaine. Colombian cartels relied on the 'Ndrangheta's reliability, and the Piromallis, allied with the Mole family, ensured shipments flowed in rhythm with the cranes. For Giuseppe, This was the crowning achievement of his strategy. The kidnappings of the 1970s had provided capital. The cement monopolies of the 1980s had embedded his family in construction. The political alliances had built a shield. And now, the port tied it all together, transforming Gioia Tauro from a poor Calabrian town into the beating heart of an international underworld economy. There's a story investigators like to tell about one container that vanished after being flagged for inspection. It was traced on paper, logged in the system, and even scheduled for a physical check. But when inspectors arrived, the container simply wasn't there. Days later, it reappeared, as if nothing had happened, only its contents were different. The explanation was never found. To locals, there was no mystery at all. If Piromalli says a box walks, it walks. Workers at the port understood the balance instinctively. Their jobs depended on the cranes lifting and ships sailing, and the Patriarch ensured stability. Wages arrived, work continued, and families ate. Many ordinary men admitted privately that they felt safer with the clan's order than with the state's neglect. The paradox was stark. While the mafia's grip was suffocating, it also provided a strange kind of predictability. Giuseppe, however, kept his distance from the daily mechanics. He was not a man to wander among containers or direct dock workers. His role was higher, quieter. He spoke to trusted lieutenants, who spoke to intermediaries, who spoke to the men who ensured containers moved as they should. The Patriarch understood delegation like few others. His power was never diluted because he never micromanaged. It radiated outward through layers of loyalty. Scholars debate whether Gioia Tauro could have succeeded as a legitimate port without mafia infiltration. Many people still think the project would have collapsed under corruption, inefficiency, and bureaucracy if the Piromallis hadn't managed it in their own way. Others argue the opposite, that mafia control strangled its potential, ensuring it became more a smuggling hub than an economic miracle. So what do you think? Was the Patriarch the port's poison, or its unlikely stabilizer? Even in the gravity of these questions, humor sometimes surfaced. Dock workers joked that containers at Gioia Tauro didn't need cranes. They walked themselves if the Patriarch wished it. Nervous laughter, yes, but it captured the truth. His influence was that pervasive. By mid-decade, the port stood as the living symbol of Giuseppe's reign. From the outside, it was Italy's promise of modernization. From within, it was the Patriarch's fortress. He had built something rare in the underworld, not just a clan that survived vendettas, not just a family that amassed wealth, but an empire that turned the machinery of the state itself into his instrument. Silence had always been Giuseppe Piromalli's greatest ally, and by the 1990s, silence itself had become a weapon. Omertà, the code of silence, wasn't just a rule for the Piromalli clan. It was the invisible cement holding Gioia Tauro together. In this small Calabrian town, people knew things without ever admitting they knew them. They saw containers move at odd hours, noticed contracts go to the same companies, watched officials dine with familiar faces. Yet when outsiders asked, shoulders shrugged, eyes narrowed, and lips sealed. The Patriarch reinforced Omertà not with endless threats, but with culture. It was tradition, pride, even survival. Giuseppe presented silence as a virtue, a Calabrian trait older than the port cranes themselves. The sea does not explain its tides, he once remarked, yet it carries ships. For him, secrecy wasn't about fear. It was about identity. Mainstream historical accounts describe Omerta as one of the central reasons the 'Ndrangheta proved nearly impossible to infiltrate compared to Sicily's Cosa Nostra. In Sicily, high-profile pentiti, turncoats, shook the mafia to its core. In Calabria, almost none came forward. Families were too tightly bound, bonds of blood too deep. And under leaders like Giuseppe Piromalli, the price of betrayal wasn't just death, it was erasure, the loss of all respect, the black mark carried by an entire bloodline. One anecdote illustrates this chilling effect. A young worker at the port witnessed a suspicious exchange, men transferring containers without paperwork. Later, investigators questioned him. The boy looked down, shuffled his feet, and said he had seen nothing. When pressed, he muttered, "Seeing is dangerous." No one challenged that logic. Giuseppe didn't need to instruct him personally. The culture of silence already lived inside every worker, every villager. Giuseppe reinforced this code in subtle ways. At family dinners, conversations about business were never spoken in front of outsiders. When children asked questions, they were gently shushed with reminders that curiosity could be dangerous. Even in church, sermons about honesty and truth were filtered through the knowledge that truth spoken at the wrong time could destroy lives. Silence was not seen as cowardice, but as loyalty. There is debate among scholars whether Omerta was sustained purely by fear, or whether it also reflected genuine belief in the clan's role as protector of the community. Many people still think that silence wasn't always coerced, that for some, it was a way of affirming identity, of saying, "We are Calabrian, and we do not speak to outsiders." So what do you think? Was Omerta only fear, or also pride, even humor, bent to silence? Locals joked that in Gioia, Tauro, if you asked for directions to the port, people would point you the wrong way just to keep practice sharp. It was a laugh, but it also carried weight. Everyone learned early that words had consequences, and silence was safer than wit. The Patriarch's mastery of Omerta gave him something priceless: invisibility. Prosecutors in Reggio Calabria found themselves staring at blank testimonies, shrugged shoulders, and witnesses who suddenly forgot entire days. Journalists who traveled south to investigate were met with polite smiles and empty phrases. Even when Giuseppe's name was whispered, it was followed by quick glances over shoulders, as though speaking it aloud might summon him. In truth, the silence surrounding him was not passive, it was active. People protected him because to betray him was to betray the order of their world. Fear was real, yes, but so was dependency. For many, the Patriarch wasn't just the shadow of Gioia Tauro. He was the stability that allowed them to live. Breaking Omerta would not only doom them individually, but unravel the fragile peace of the entire community. By the height of his reign, Giuseppe Piromalli had achieved what few bosses ever did. He had transformed silence into permanence. His enemies could not outshout him because he had trained a town to speak in whispers, or not at all. And in the hush of Gioia Tauro's evenings, as the port lights flickered against the sea, silence itself carried the Patriarch's voice. Politics in Calabria had always been a delicate dance, and Giuseppe Piromalli knew every step. By the 1990s, the Patriarch was no longer just a figure of the underworld. He was also a shadow presence in town halls and council chambers. Mayors, councilors, and regional officials might have held the official titles, but everyone knew their strength depended on the invisible nod of the Piromalli clan. And behind them, all stood Giuseppe, calm and calculating. He never appeared at rallies, never gave speeches, never posed for photographs, yet politicians visited him quietly, sometimes in the evenings, sometimes in the middle of Sunday afternoons, as if paying respect to a man who held no office, yet carried more weight than any ballot box. They came with proposals, seeking approval, a construction project here, a contract there, promises of jobs and votes. All of it passed through the Patriarch's filter. Mainstream historical records reveal how deeply the 'Ndrangheta infiltrated local politics in Calabria during this period. Vote buying, campaign financing, and manipulation of contracts were standard tools. Giuseppe excelled at turning these tools into instruments of quiet control. He understood that politicians were fragile, dependent on re-election, vulnerable to scandals, and often desperate for funds. By supporting them discreetly, he made them his clients. One anecdote captures this perfectly. A mayor in a nearby town once refused to approve a Piromalli-linked company for a municipal project, insisting on transparency. Weeks later, his council fractured. Allies abandoned him, votes shifted, and he suddenly found himself facing a no-confidence motion. He resigned quietly, and another man, friendly with the Patriarch, slipped into his place. No threats, no public scandal, just the slow erosion of support until the office was empty. Giuseppe understood politics like erosion, patient, relentless, and inevitable. At times, he even played kingmaker. Candidates rumored to have his blessing found campaign donations arriving from unexpected places, turnout in certain districts rising mysteriously, and rivals stumbling on sudden scandals. Giuseppe never appeared in the stories, but everyone knew. In Calabria, endorsement was not about television ads or debates. It was about whether the Patriarch's name was whispered in your favor. There's a scholarly debate about whether this political influence made the Piromalli clan a parallel government, or whether it simply reflected the vacuum left by Rome. Many people still think that without mafia support, no politician in Gioia Tauro could govern effectively because the state's reach was too weak, its promises too thin. So what do you think? Were men like Giuseppe undermining democracy, or were they simply stepping in where democracy had already failed? Giuseppe's own approach to politicians was characteristically understated. He never bullied. He rarely raised his voice. Instead, he reminded them of shared interests. "We both want Gioia Tauro to prosper," he would say. "I only ensure it happens." To some, his tone felt almost paternal, calm, reassuring, the voice of a man who offered order in a chaotic world. But beneath it was the unspoken truth. Prosperity meant obedience. Even humor touched this dark alliance. Locals joked that in elections, you didn't ask who the people voted for. You asked who Piromalli allowed them to vote for. The laughter was nervous, but the truth lingered. Politicians might print posters and shake hands, but everyone knew the Patriarch's handshake carried more votes than 1,000 campaign flyers. By the mid-1990s, Giuseppe Piromalli had perfected the art of political friendship. His allies sat in councils, controlled budgets, and awarded contracts. His enemies found their careers cut short, and all the while, the Patriarch remained in the background, a man who never ran for office yet held more power than those who did. From the cobblestone alleys of Gioia Tauro to the polished chambers of regional councils, politics bent quietly toward him. He was not the elected ruler of Calabria, but he was, in every meaningful sense, the patriarch of its fate. Giuseppe Piromalli's demeanor was unlike that of many mafia bosses who came before or after him. Where others relied on swagger, on loud declarations of power, or on bloody spectacles meant to terrify. Giuseppe leaned on something far subtler, a calm voice and an expression that never betrayed urgency. Those who dealt with him spoke of an unnerving serenity, as though nothing could rattle him, as though every decision had already been weighed long before the conversation began. He cultivated this manner deliberately. The Patriarch wanted no part of theatrics. He dressed simply, often in muted suits, blending in with any elder statesman of southern Italy. He rarely raised his tone, even when delivering judgments that could ruin a business or end a life. His power came not from shouting, but from the way silence seemed to thicken after he spoke. Associates described meetings where men argued passionately until Giuseppe finally lifted his head and uttered a single sentence. Suddenly, the debate ended. It wasn't fear of what he might do. It was certainty that his word was final. Mainstream historical accounts emphasize this quiet authority as a hallmark of the 'Ndrangheta compared to the flashier Sicilian mafia. The Calabrian clans thrived precisely because they hid behind ordinariness. Giuseppe embodied this perfectly. To an outsider, he might have looked like any respectable pensioner sipping espresso in the town square. To insiders, the calm way he stirred his cup was enough to make entire unions, contracts, and clans bend to his will. One anecdote is often recalled by locals. A businessman once tried to protest against Piromalli's demands during a meeting. Giuseppe listened patiently, never interrupting, his hands folded neatly on the table. When the man finished, Giuseppe leaned forward and, in a measured tone, said only, "Do what you feel is best, for your children's sake." No threats, no raised voice, only that quiet suggestion. The man agreed within the hour. The Patriarch understood that words delivered with serenity could cut deeper than shouts or gunfire. The calm exterior made him unpredictable. Rivals could not read him, politicians could not provoke him, and even prosecutors found themselves frustrated by his composure during questioning. One investigator once remarked that speaking to Giuseppe was like arguing with stone. No cracks, no echoes, only stillness. And yet, this calmness wasn't emptiness. It carried a terrifying subtext. Everyone who encountered him felt the weight beneath the quiet. It was the silence of Calabria's hills, which look serene until you remember how many secrets they have swallowed. There is an ongoing scholarly debate about whether Giuseppe's demeanor was a natural trait or a carefully constructed mask. Many people still think that he simply had the temperament of a patient patriarch, while others argue that he consciously crafted this persona to make himself untouchable. So what do you think? Was it natural serenity or the perfect disguise? Even humor bent to this aura. Workers joked that Piromalli could order a man's ruin with less volume than it took to order a coffee. The line always drew nervous chuckles, but no one doubted its truth. By the mid-1990s, Giuseppe Piromalli's calm voice had become more feared than the loudest threats of other clans. His authority radiated not from explosions or vendettas, but from the stillness he carried into every room. The Patriarch had discovered something few bosses ever mastered: terror wrapped in tranquility, power delivered in whispers. And in Gioia, Tauro, that calm presence was everywhere. On the docks, in the town halls, in the hearts of those who knew that one word, softly spoken, could change everything. The Piromalli clan could not dominate Gioia Tauro without constantly balancing fragile relationships with rivals. Chief among these were the Mole family and the Mancusos. Calabria was never a land where one family could rule alone. It was a chessboard crowded with pieces, and every move risked igniting decades of vendetta. Giuseppe Piromalli, with his gift for patience, became not just a patriarch of his own family, but an arbiter of fragile peace. The Mole family, based in the same territory, were both indispensable allies and dangerous competitors. Together, the Piromallis and Mole effectively shared control of the port. Their arrangement was often called a partnership, but everyone knew that partnerships in Calabria were made of glass, appearing strong until pressure cracked them. Giuseppe, with his calm tone and deliberate silences, ensured the glass never shattered. Meetings between the two clans resembled tense boardroom negotiations more than mafia councils. They divided contracts, split influence in unions, and coordinated drug shipments. But beneath the surface, distrust simmered. The Mancusos, further north, sought a greater share of trafficking routes that passed through Gioia Tauro. Their ambitions clashed with the Piromalli sphere, and tensions occasionally threatened to spill over. Yet Giuseppe managed to turn even these rivalries into leverage. By occasionally yielding small favors, he bought time and prevented feuds. His philosophy was simple. A port full of containers is worth more than a graveyard full of men. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that the 'Ndrangheta avoided the catastrophic wars that weakened the Sicilian Cosa Nostra in the same period. This relative stability owed much to leaders like Giuseppe, who understood the cost of constant vendetta. He turned negotiations into an art form, keeping rivals close enough to trade with, but not close enough to betray. One remembered episode involves a dispute over a lucrative customs contract. The Moles pushed aggressively, threatening to cut Piromalli men out. Younger hotheads in Giuseppe's circle wanted immediate retaliation. Instead, the Patriarch invited Mole representatives to his home. The dinner was simple: wine, bread, olives. At the end, Giuseppe spoke quietly. "If this house falls, yours falls too. Let us build stronger walls, not weaker." By morning, the contract was split amicably. Bloodshed was avoided, and the port continued humming. There is debate among scholars whether Giuseppe's diplomacy truly prevented war, or merely delayed the inevitable. Many people still think that his balancing act postponed conflict, but never resolved the underlying rivalries. So what do you think? Was he a genuine peacemaker, or just a careful gambler playing for time? Still, Giuseppe understood that alliances were fragile. He kept meticulous records of obligations: who owed what, who had been granted favors, who had failed to deliver. This ledger of debts gave him leverage during disputes. A Mole request for assistance on a drug shipment could be answered with a reminder: "Do you remember the contract I gave you? Today you return it." Such reminders, delivered in his calm tone, carried more weight than threats. Even humor appeared at these meetings. A Mole associate once joked nervously that splitting contracts with the Patriarch was like splitting bread at dinner. He always managed to keep the larger slice. Giuseppe allowed himself a dry smile, but said nothing. Silence itself confirmed the truth. By the mid-1990s, Gioia Tauro existed in a precarious balance. Rivals pressed, allies schemed, but the Patriarch's steady hand kept the glass from breaking. He knew that if open war erupted, the port would collapse under police scrutiny and political scandal. So, he maintained the uneasy peace, weaving trust and fear together like threads in a net. And in that net, every rival, Mole, Mancuso or otherwise, was caught, unable to escape the gravitational pull of Gioia Tauro and the man who quietly ruled it. By the 1990s, Calabria was no longer dealing only with local rivalries and Italian politics. The world had arrived at Gioia Tauro in steel boxes, stacked high on container ships that sailed from South America. And inside many of those containers was the true currency of a new era: cocaine. The Colombian cartels needed reliable partners in Europe, and while they had flirted with Sicilian bosses, it was the Calabrian clans, rooted in family loyalty and bound by omertà, that proved the better allies. For Giuseppe Piromalli, the Patriarch, these connections were the final piece of his empire. He never traveled to Colombia, never posed with traffickers, never left Gioia Tauro. He didn't have to. The 'Ndrangheta's younger emissaries handled the travel, the negotiations, the risky meetings in Madrid, Caracas, or Bogotá. Giuseppe's role was simpler but more profound. He provided the port, the logistics, and the guarantee that containers would move unmolested once they arrived. The Colombians could supply endless product, but without Gioia Tauro's cranes, it would rot at sea. The Patriarch turned his sleepy Calabrian town into Europe's cocaine gateway. Mainstream historical studies confirm that by the mid-1990s, the 'Ndrangheta controlled as much as 80% of Europe's cocaine import routes, eclipsing even the Sicilian mafia in narcotics. Gioia Tauro's unique position, a massive port, lightly monitored, dominated by a single clan, was the perfect entry point. And at the center of this stood the Piromalli-Molay alliance, with Giuseppe Piromalli's calm hand guiding the machinery. There's a story investigators love to tell about a particular ship that arrived from Venezuela. Customs flagged several containers for inspection, but when the officers arrived, they found paperwork so pristine, so neatly filed, that they waved them through. Weeks later, tons of cocaine were discovered already distributed across Europe, traced back to those very containers. The Patriarch hadn't lifted a finger, yet his invisible authority had ensured everything ran smoothly. Giuseppe himself was cautious about drugs. He knew the profits were astronomical, but he also knew drugs brought scrutiny, scandals, and pentiti, informants. So he kept his distance, never speaking of cocaine directly, always referring to it in euphemisms. The special cargo, he might say, or the goods that move quickly. This distance kept his name cleaner, his image more paternal than criminal. His genius wasn't in denying reality, it was in making sure reality couldn't be pinned to him. Scholars debate whether he personally orchestrated the drug deals, or whether he simply allowed the younger Piromallis and Moles to manage them. Many people still think his brilliance lay in letting others take the risks, while he quietly gathered the rewards. So, what do you think? Was he the architect of Europe's cocaine routes, or simply the wise patriarch who made them possible without ever touching the product? Humor even surfaced among dock workers aware of the trade. They joked that Gioia Tauro was the port where sugar was sweeter than sugar. Everyone laughed nervously, pretending not to understand. But the laughter carried truth. They knew what passed through the containers stacked like silent dominoes on the docks. By this time, the Patriarch's empire stretched far beyond Calabria. Money from cocaine sales flowed into banks in Switzerland, properties in northern Italy, and offshore accounts in the Caribbean. Yet Giuseppe himself remained anchored in Gioia Tauro, sipping espresso in the same cafes, walking the same narrow streets. His calm presence made the extraordinary seem ordinary, as if the transformation of a small Calabrian town into the beating heart of Europe's drug trade was just another part of its destiny. By the late 1990s, no one doubted it anymore. Gioia Tauro had become the crossroads of continents, and the Patriarch of Gioia Tauro, Giuseppe Piromalli, had achieved what few bosses ever did. He had turned a global drug empire into something invisible, ordinary, and enduring, woven seamlessly into the rhythms of ships, cranes, and the hush of Calabrian evenings. The 1990s also brought the winds of justice blowing harder across Italy. Palermo had seen the Maxi trials shake Cosa Nostra in the 1980s, and prosecutors now turned their eyes to Calabria. They wanted a similar blow against the 'Ndrangheta. Courtrooms filled, indictments stacked high, and investigators spoke grandly of severing the Piromalli roots from Gioia Tauro, once and for all. Yet Giuseppe Piromalli, the Patriarch, faced this storm with the same calm he had shown since youth. The trials were vast affairs. Prosecutors assembled mountains of evidence, wiretaps, seized ledgers, testimonies from frightened witnesses. They tried to connect construction contracts, union strikes, and drug shipments back to Giuseppe. But the Patriarch had spent decades ensuring his distance. His fingerprints were never on the drugs. His signature was never on the contracts. His voice, if ever recorded, spoke only in riddles or polite pleasantries. It was like trying to catch the wind in a net. Mainstream historical accounts describe these Calabrian Maxi trials as sprawling, but often inconclusive compared to Palermo's. In Sicily, pentiti, turncoats, poured out stories that toppled entire structures. In Calabria, omertà held firm. Few dared to speak. Even those who did often recanted on the stand, suddenly struck by lost memory. Judges sighed, journalists shook their heads, and prosecutors fumed as case after case collapsed. One anecdote is particularly telling. During a hearing, prosecutors played a recording where Giuseppe, over coffee, discussed special cargo. They insisted it meant cocaine. But his defense lawyer smiled, spread his hands, and asked the court, "In Calabria, what is more special than olive oil? Can anyone prove he was not speaking of that?" The courtroom chuckled, and the tape lost its force. The Patriarch had wrapped himself in plausible deniability so tightly that even his own words could not bind him. Still, the trials were not without danger. Associates were convicted, allies imprisoned, assets seized. The Patriarch himself faced long stretches behind bars, but even there, he seemed untouchable. Visitors carried coded instructions. Lawyers repeated his opinions. His calm voice echoed beyond prison walls, shaping contracts and silencing disputes. The state had him in body, but his influence drifted freely through Calabria, like smoke slipping through keyholes. There is debate among scholars whether these trials were failures of the judiciary or triumphs of mafia resilience. Many people still think that prosecutors underestimated the cultural grip of the 'Ndrangheta, imagining they could fight it with the same methods used in Sicily. So what do you think? Was justice simply too weak? Or was the Patriarch's system too deeply woven into Calabria's soul? Even humor colored the era. Locals joked that the only thing the trials ever proved was that Giuseppe Piromalli drank more coffee than anyone else in Gioia Tauro. It was a laugh tinged with truth. Most of the recordings the prosecutors prized were nothing more than his low, calm voice, discussing weather, family, or shipments that might have meant anything. By the close of the decade, the Maxi trials had made headlines, but the Patriarch endured. The courts had rattled his empire but not destroyed it. If anything, his legend deepened. To his followers, he was the man who outlasted the state's greatest effort. To his enemies, he was the shadow that trials could never cage. And to Calabria, he remained what he had always been, the quiet figure who ruled Gioia Tauro, not from a throne, but from silence. Prison walls might have held Giuseppe Piromalli's body, but they never confined his reach. By the mid-1990s, investigators were baffled by how seamlessly his orders continued to flow from behind bars. Associates carried instructions through coded phrases in legal conversations. Family members acted as intermediaries, repeating his words in tones so casual they seemed like ordinary family chatter. Even priests and doctors, unknowingly or not, sometimes became conduits of messages. The Patriarch had mastered the art of ruling invisibly. Within prison, he lived with the same restraint that had defined his rise. He never demanded special treatment, never drew attention to himself. Guards noted that he walked slowly, politely greeted them, and spent hours reading newspapers or writing letters. Yet everyone sensed that beneath this calm exterior, he was orchestrating an empire. His cell became less a cage and more a command post. Quiet, but effective. Mainstream historical accounts highlight the uncanny resilience of the 'Ndrangheta during the 1990s. While Sicilian bosses crumbled under relentless state pressure, Calabrian families endured, often because their leaders could run operations even from confinement. Giuseppe embodied this phenomenon. His voice was absent from the streets of Gioia, Tauro, but the rhythm of the port, the flow of contracts, and the hush of omertà continued exactly as before. One story tells of a business dispute that escalated while Giuseppe was imprisoned. Two contractors bickered over payment for port work, and tensions threatened to boil into violence. Suddenly, both sides received visits from men who claimed to have spoken with the old man. A quiet agreement was reached, and the conflict vanished. The Patriarch's hand had settled the matter without ever leaving his cell. Scholars debate how much of this continued influence was personal genius versus structural inevitability. Many people still think the Piromalli clan had become so deeply woven into Calabria's political and economic fabric that even if Giuseppe had died in prison, the machine would have kept running. So what do you think? Was it his singular leadership, or the unstoppable inertia of a system he had perfected? In prison, Giuseppe rarely spoke of mafia life directly. His conversations revolved around health, family, the weather, always innocuous on the surface, but hidden in his tone, in the order of his words, in which name he mentioned first or last, lay coded instructions. Those who knew him could interpret these subtleties as clearly as written contracts. A phrase as simple as, "The olives are late this year," could signal a delay in shipments. A remark about bread being enough for all might mean a contract was to be divided peacefully. Even humor carried through the bars. A guard once asked him how he stayed so calm with years of confinement ahead. Giuseppe smiled faintly and replied, "Calabria's mountains do not move, so why should I?" The line spread among inmates and staff alike, cementing his image as a man unshaken by time or walls. By the late 1990s, prosecutors admitted reluctantly that imprisonment had not diminished him. If anything, it reinforced his legend. He had proven what few bosses could, that leadership did not depend on freedom of movement, but on the weight of reputation, the depth of loyalty, and the power of silence. For Gioia Tauro, nothing changed. The cranes still swung, containers still moved, and contracts still flowed. The Patriarch remained, as always, the unseen force guiding them. Behind steel bars, his shadow stretched just as far, reminding Calabria that prison could not silence Giuseppe Piromalli. Legacy was never an afterthought for Giuseppe Piromalli. It was the backbone of his strategy. By the late 1990s, age and confinement had made him think less about day-to-day orders and more about ensuring the Piromalli name would endure. The Patriarch knew empires built on violence could vanish in a decade, but empires built on loyalty and continuity could outlast generations. So he turned his attention to grooming the next wave: sons, nephews, and trusted kin who would inherit not just his wealth, but his discipline. In Calabria, succession wasn't formalized with documents or wills. It was taught in gestures, in dinners, in the careful seating of men at the family council table. A nephew invited to sit closer meant more than any written title. A son, trusted with delivering a subtle message to a politician, learned more than he ever could from textbooks. Giuseppe passed on his methods not through speeches, but through lived example. His restraint, his calmness, his obsession with silence, these became the inheritance more valuable than money. Mainstream historical accounts show that the 'Ndrangheta thrived precisely because it embedded leadership within bloodlines. Unlike Cosa Nostra, where betrayal and splintering could topple powerful bosses, Calabrian clans maintained resilience by making leadership a family business. Giuseppe embodied this model. He trained the younger Piromallis not to chase glory, not to indulge recklessness, but to think like patriarchs, measured, patient, invisible. One remembered moment from Gioia, Tauro captures this teaching style. At a baptism, surrounded by family and priests, Giuseppe leaned toward a young relative and whispered, "This is how we build trust, with God as witness, but with family as judge." The child didn't understand then, but the words were repeated to him years later when he sat at the council table, realizing the Patriarch had been preparing him since childhood. There is a debate among scholars whether Giuseppe truly succeeded in grooming a loyal new generation, or whether inevitable rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Many people still think that younger Piromallis, raised in the era of cocaine profits, lacked the Patriarch's patience, preferring faster wealth and riskier ventures. So what do you think? Was his legacy secure, or was it fragile in the hands of heirs who may not have shared his restraint? Giuseppe himself worried about this. In private, he sometimes remarked that wealth made men careless, and that the young did not value silence as their fathers had. "They think money is everything," he once muttered, "but money talks too loudly." He tried to instill humility, reminding them that the family survived not by boasting, but by blending into Calabria's fabric. Even humor played into these lessons. Once, when a nephew flaunted a new car, Giuseppe reportedly tapped the hood and said, "A shiny car makes the police look twice. Better you drive a donkey and arrive safely." The room laughed, but the Patriarch's point landed. By the end of the 1990s, Giuseppe's role was shifting from commander to teacher. He no longer needed to micromanage contracts or shipments. His presence alone, his occasional words at family gatherings, carried the weight of law. The younger men handled the machinery. Giuseppe ensured they never forgot the rules. He was building continuity, ensuring that long after his voice fell silent, the Piromalli name would still echo in Gioia, Tauro. The cranes of the port might belong to the state, but their rhythm would remain tied to the bloodlines he had nurtured, the silence he had taught, and the legacy he refused to leave to chance. To understand Giuseppe Piromalli's legacy, one must look not only at the contracts, the cranes, and the cocaine routes, but also at the paradoxical life of the community around him. Gioia Tauro in the 1990s lived under a dual reality. On the surface, it was a town awakening to industry. Families had steady wages at the port, shops filled with new goods, Children dreamed of futures brighter than their parents had known. Beneath the surface, everyone understood that this prosperity was tethered to the Patriarch's shadow. The paradox was sharp. Many residents both feared and respected Giuseppe. They whispered about him with reverence, never daring to speak his name too loudly. Mothers told their children to stay out of trouble, to never ask questions about certain men. But those same mothers also thanked the Patriarch silently when wages arrived on time or when disputes in the town ended without bloodshed. In their eyes, the state was distant, abstract. Rome was hundreds of miles away, but Piromalli's presence was on every street corner. Mainstream history confirms that this blending of fear and reliance was one of the 'Ndrangheta's defining traits. Unlike other mafia groups that flaunted violence, the Calabrian clans embedded themselves so deeply into community life that resistance felt impossible. For many, silence wasn't just survival. It was routine. Giuseppe's genius was in reinforcing that duality. He didn't make himself a tyrant. He made himself inevitable. One story often retold involves a neighborhood dispute over land boundaries. Two families quarreled, shouting threats, on the verge of violence. Instead of calling the police, they went to Giuseppe. He listened, weighed the arguments, and calmly redrew the boundary line. Both families accepted it. The matter never reached court. To the villagers, this wasn't unusual. It was expected. The Patriarch was the law they trusted, even as they feared the price of disobedience. Scholars debate whether this paradox helped or harmed Calabria in the long run. Many people still think that Piromalli's order prevented the chaos of vendettas, keeping Gioia Tauro more stable than other regions. Others argue that this stability came at the cost of freedom, locking the community into a cycle of silence and dependence. So what do you think? Was the Patriarch a stabilizer or a jailer? Giuseppe himself seemed content with this dual role. He did not crave admiration, nor did he seek fear for its own sake. He wanted continuity, and continuity required both. His demeanor, a calm gaze, a steady tone, embodied the contradiction, reassuring and terrifying at once. Even humor reflected it. Locals quipped that in Gioia Tauro, the Patriarch was like the church bell. Everyone lived by its rhythm, and no one dared complain about the noise. The laughter was soft, but the truth resonated. As the 1990s drew to a close, Giuseppe Piromalli's twilight years approached. Yet his presence remained unshaken. He had survived kidnappings, cement monopolies, political alliances, and maxi trials. He had turned a small Calabrian town into a hub of global trade and crime, steering it with patience rather than spectacle. To his family, he was the Patriarch. To the state, he was a ghost they could not cage. To the people of Gioia Tauro, he was both protector and oppressor, the man who defined their fate. And when the sun set over the Tyrrhenian Sea, casting long shadows across the cranes of Gioia Tauro's port, those shadows seemed to merge with the figure of the old man himself, quiet, immovable, and eternal in the memory of Calabria. And now, as our story of Giuseppe Piromalli draws to its close, let the pace ease, let the edges soften. The noise of cranes and containers fades into the background, replaced by the gentle hush of Calabrian waves rolling against the shore. Imagine the town settling into twilight, windows glowing faintly, conversations tapering into whispers. The Patriarch's shadow still lingers, but in this moment, it is only memory, drifting like smoke into the evening air. Breathe deeply, slowly. The air carries the scent of olive groves, faint and steady, and the sea hums its timeless lullaby. The long arc of history rests now, the trials, the contracts, the silences folded neatly into the past. What remains is the stillness of a Calabrian night, where the only sound is the rhythm of your own breath. Let yourself sink into that quiet. Picture the mountains that never move, the hills standing watch over centuries of secrets, the horizon stretching endlessly into the dark. Just as the people of Gioia, Tauro lived beneath the weight of unseen forces, you too can let go of what presses on your shoulders. For now, you carry nothing. The silence is a gift. Close your eyes to the images of bustling ports and whispered councils. Hold instead the picture of a single light flickering in a window, steady, calm, eternal. Let that light guide you gently into rest. The story has ended, but the quiet remains. Carry it with you into your dreams as the waves of Calabria wash everything into peace. Sleep comes easily now, like a tide that cannot be resisted. Drift with it, softly, without fear.